The phone rang, a shrill tear in the quiet fabric of Laura Vance's small apartment. She let it ring 3 times, a small, pointless act of rebellion. On the fourth ring, she answered, knowing exactly who it would be. Her mother, Eleanor, never waited for a fifth. Alara, darling, I was just about to hang up. Eleanor's voice was a confection of spun sugar and finely ground glass. It was the voice she used for public appearances and for delivering bad news as if it were a gift. Ellie braced herself, leaning against the cool laminate of her kitchen counter. Hi, Mom. I was just in the middle of something. A lie. She had been staring at a crack in the ceiling, tracing its path with her eyes and wondering if that's how a heart breaks, slowly and from unseen pressures. Well, this is important. I have the most wonderful news, and I wanted you to hear it from me. The practice pause was for dramatic effect. Your sister is engaged to Markham Thorne. Ellie's fingers tightened on the phone until her knuckles were white peaks in a pale landscape. Mark, her Mark, the man she had spent 4 years with, the man who had held her hand and whispered about a future that now belonged to someone else, her own sister. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of her old refrigerator. Ellie, are you there? Did you hear me? Eleanor's voice lost some of its sweetness, replaced by a familiar edge of impatience. I heard you, Ellie said. Her own voice was a stranger, flat and distant. That's fast. It was the only word she could find that wasn't a scream. Mark and Chloe had only been a public item for 6 months. 6 months since he had sat across from Ellie in a sterile coffee shop and told her he needed to find himself. It seemed he had found himself in her younger sister's bed. Oh, don't be like that, dear. When you know, and they are just so perfect together. The Thornes are ecstatic. Of course they were. The Vance family's precarious social standing was propped up by the Thorne family's old money, a relationship Eleanor guarded like a dragon. Anyway, we're having a celebratory dinner, Saturday night, 8 o'clock, at the Gilded Lily. You received the invitation, I trust. Ellie's gaze fell upon the thick, cream-colored envelope on her counter. She hadn't opened it. She didn't need to. She could feel the smug, embossed lettering through the paper. It's here. Good. Now, I expect you to be there, Iara, and I expect you to be happy for your sister. This is a big moment for our family. No long faces, no drama. We need to present a united front. A united front, as if she were a soldier being ordered to applaud her own execution. Mom, I don't think I can, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. It's too soon. Nonsense, Eleanor snapped, the last of the sugar dissolving completely. It has been months. It's time to be an adult. Chloe is worried you'll make a scene. Don't prove her right. Wear that nice blue dress, the one that makes you look less tired. 8 o'clock. Don't be late. The line went dead. Ellie didn't move. She stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the dial tone. A scene. Chloe was worried she'd make a scene. Chloe, with her perfect blonde hair and bright blue eyes, who had spent a lifetime taking whatever she wanted, including Ellie's favorite dress for prom, her spot on the debate team, and now her future. Chloe, who had cried on Ellie's shoulder about a boy just a year ago, all while secretly meeting Mark for coffee. Slowly, Ellie lowered the phone. She picked up the invitation. Her thumb traced the raised script. Chloe and Markham. The names sat side by side, so comfortable, so correct. The ring would be the one Ellie had bookmarked on a jewelry website a year ago. A cushion-cut diamond she had shown Mark one evening, her heart thumping with unspoken hope. She was certain Chloe was wearing it now. The thought was a physical pain, a hot poker pressed against her chest. She was expected to go to a fancy restaurant, sit at a table with her smiling, treacherous family, and toast the happiness of the 2 people who had ripped her life apart. And she was to do it gracefully. She was to do it without making a scene. A wave of nausea and helpless rage washed over her. She wanted to tear the invitation to shreds. She wanted to throw her phone against the wall. She wanted to disappear. But she did none of those things. She was Alara Vance, the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who cleaned up messes and never complained. She slid the invitation back onto the counter and went to get ready for work. Her movements were stiff, robotic. Her own body felt like a cage. The Grand Sovereign Hotel was a world away from her tiny apartment. Here, marble floors gleamed under the light of crystal chandeliers. The air was cool and smelled faintly of lilies and money. Ellie moved through it all with practiced invisibility, her simple black uniform a cloak of anonymity. She was a supervisor in the events department, a job that required meticulous attention to detail and the ability to solve problems before the wealthy guests even knew they existed. Her world was one of backstage corridors and service elevators. It was a place of stainless steel, fluorescent lights, and the constant low hum of industrial dishwashers and ventilation systems. She preferred it to the opulent front of house. It was honest. Here, things were what they were. There was no pretense. She was doing her final rounds, checking the private dining suites on the mezzanine level. Most were empty, the tables set with starched white linens and gleaming silverware, waiting for the evening's patrons. The silence was deep, almost reverent. As she passed the Bordeaux suite, she heard a sound, a soft, wet thud, followed by a choked, rasping noise. It wasn't a scream. It was something more primal, more desperate. Her training kicked in, overriding a flicker of hesitation. She pushed the heavy oak door open. "Hello? Is everything all right?" The scene inside was one of quiet chaos. A single diner sat at a large empty table. He was an imposing man, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit that seemed to absorb the light in the room. His chair was pushed back, and one hand was clutching his throat. His face, which might have been handsome, was contorting, turning a dusky, alarming shade of purple. His eyes, dark and wide with panic, met hers. An overturned water glass had pooled on the polished wood. A half-eaten meal, a large steak, sat on the plate before him. He was choking. There was no one else around. The servers were likely prepping for the main dinner rush. It was just her. For a heartbeat, the world slowed. She saw the sheer animal terror in his eyes, the silent, desperate plea. All the helplessness she had felt that morning, the feeling of being trapped and suffocated by her own life, seemed to find a horrifying, literal echo in this stranger. But this was a problem she could solve. This was a fire she could put out. "Sir, I'm going to help you," she said, her voice clear and calm, cutting through the thick silence. She dropped her clipboard, the clatter loud in the still room. She moved behind him, her mind racing through the first aid course she had been forced to take 2 years ago. "I'm going to perform the Heimlich maneuver." She wrapped her arms around his torso. It was an awkward, intimate embrace with a dying man. He was solid, powerful, even in his distress. She made a fist with one hand, placed it just above his navel, and covered it with her other hand. Then she drove her fist inward and upward with all her strength. Nothing. The man's body shuddered, a terrible guttural sound escaping his throat. His dark eyes were starting to glaze over. Panic licked at the edges of her composure. She couldn't fail. She repositioned her hands, leaned in, and thrust again, harder this time, using her entire body weight. The effect was immediate and violent. A piece of meat shot out of his mouth, landing on the pristine white tablecloth like a bloody punctuation mark. The man collapsed forward, gasping, sucking in air with huge, ragged, life-giving breaths. The sound was the most beautiful thing Ellie had ever heard. She stepped back, her own heart hammering against her ribs. Adrenaline sang through her veins. He stayed hunched over for a long moment, his shoulders shaking as he coughed and drew in air. Slowly, painstakingly, he straightened up. He reached for the linen napkin and wiped his mouth with a steady hand. The alarming color was already receding from his face, leaving behind a stark pallor. He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were no longer panicked. They were dark, impossibly deep, and filled with an unnerving intensity. They scanned her from head to toe, not in a leering way, but with a cool, unnerving assessment. It felt like being weighed and measured. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low and raspy from the ordeal, but it held an undeniable current of power. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You're welcome," Ellie managed, her professionalism a thin shield. "Should I call a doctor? We have a medic on staff." He shook his head, taking another slow, deliberate breath. "That won't be necessary. You were sufficient." He ran a hand over his jaw, his composure returning with breathtaking speed. Only a faint sheen of sweat on his brow hinted at what had just happened. He looked at the piece of food on the table, then back at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. "Your name," he commanded more than asked. "Alara Vance. I'm an event supervisor here." "Alara," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It sounded different in his mouth, less like the name her mother always sighed with disappointment, and more like something solid, something real. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced a slim black wallet. From it, he extracted a single business card. It was made of thick, heavy stock, matte black on both sides. In the center, embossed in simple silver lettering, were just two words and a string of numbers. Damien Costello. There was no company name, no title, no address, just a name and a number. He held it out to her. Ellie hesitated for a second before taking it. The card was cool and heavy in her hand. It felt significant. "I don't accept tips," she said automatically, a line drilled into all hotel staff. A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. "This is not a tip, Alara. This is a debt. I do not like being in debt." He stood up, his full height making the grand dining room seem smaller. He was tall, lean, and moved with a quiet, predatory grace. She noticed a faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow, just grazing his temple. "If you ever find yourself in a situation where you need something," he said, his dark eyes boring into hers, "anything at all, you call that number. It will be answered." The way he said it left no room for doubt. It wasn't a polite, empty gesture. It was a binding promise. A chill that had nothing to do with the room's air conditioning traced its way down her spine. This was not a man who made idle offers. The power radiating from him was a palpable force, quiet and absolute. He was dangerous. She knew it with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. "Thank you, Mr. Costello," she said, slipping the card into the pocket of her uniform trousers. He simply gave her a curt nod, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Ellie alone with the silence, the soiled tablecloth, and the lingering scent of his expensive cologne. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her hands were trembling. She had just saved a man's life. A man whose name she now knew was Damien Costello, and for some reason that knowledge felt as perilous as it did powerful. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. The mundane tasks of checking table arrangements and coordinating with the kitchen staff felt surreal after the life and death intensity of the Bordeaux suite. Every time her hand brushed against her pocket, she felt the sharp, rectangular edge of the card. A debt, he had called it. When she finally got home, her apartment felt smaller, shabbier. The weak yellow light from her single lamp seemed to mock the grandeur of the hotel. And there on the counter, still waiting for her, was the invitation. It seemed to glow with a malevolent energy. Saturday, the Gilded Lily, 8 o'clock. She saw it all in her mind's eye. The pitying glances from extended family, the smug, triumphant smile on Chloe's face, the way Mark would refuse to meet her eyes, his handsome face a mask of guilt and weak justification. And her mother, her sharp, critical gaze, following Ellie's every move, daring her to crack, daring her to ruin the perfect family picture. She would have to sit there and absorb it all. She would have to lift a glass of champagne and toast to the theft of her own heart. The humiliation was a physical thing, a thick, cloying substance rising in her throat. The same suffocating feeling she had seen on Damien Costello's face. But there was no one to save her. There was no one to perform a maneuver that would dislodge the lump of pain and rage lodged in her soul. She was trapped. They had built a cage of social obligation and family duty around her, and she was expected to sit inside it and sing. Her hand, moving of its own accord, went to her pocket. She pulled out the black card, Damien Costello. The silver letters seemed to shimmer in the dim light. A debt. His words echoed in her ears. "If you ever find yourself in a situation where you need something, anything at all." This was a situation on. This was a drowning, a slow, public suffocation. What did she need? She needed to not be the victim at that table. She needed to not be the pitiful, jilted older sister. She needed a shield. She needed a weapon. She needed to wipe the smug smiles off their faces. She needed them to feel, just for 1 second, the same shock and fear that she was living with every single day. A wild, terrifying idea began to form in her mind. It was insane. It was reckless. It was a plunge into a darkness she couldn't possibly comprehend. But it was also the only thing that felt like air. It was the only path that didn't end with her quietly choking on her own tears at that dinner table. Her hand was trembling so hard she could barely hold her phone. With numb fingers, she looked at the card, then typed the digits into her keypad. She pressed the call button before she could lose her nerve. It rang only once. A low, calm voice answered. The same voice from the dining room, though no longer raspy. Costello. Ellie's breath hitched. For a second, she couldn't speak. The sheer audacity of what she was about to do threatened to swallow her whole. She closed her eyes, picturing Chloe's dazzling smile, Mark's weak chin, her mother's disappointed frown. The images hardened her resolve. She took a shaky breath, her voice barely a whisper, but clear in the silence of her apartment. Hello, Mr. Costello. My name is Alara Vance. You said to call if I needed something. She paused, gathering every last scrap of her courage. I need to hire a date. The silence on the other end of the line was not empty. It was a dense, weighted quiet, the kind that absorbs sound and leaves a vacuum in its wake. Ellie's own breathing felt loud, intrusive. She could hear the frantic drumming of her pulse in her ears, a frantic counterpoint to the man's unnerving calm. She had spoken the words. She had thrown her desperate, wild little stone into a deep, dark lake, and now she was waiting for the splash. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, smooth murmur, completely devoid of surprise. He simply said an address, a bar named The Alchemist's Respite, and a time, tomorrow, at 9. Then the line went dead. She stood in her kitchen for a full minute, the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the dial tone. It was done. The first step off a cliff she could not see the bottom of. The Alchemist's Respite was not the kind of place you found by accident. It was tucked away in a cobblestone alley, marked only by a small, unlit sign of a raven holding a key. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old leather, whiskey, and something else. Something clean and metallic like cold money. The room was bathed in a low, amber light from shaded lamps, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Dark wood, deep velvet booths, and a bar of polished black marble. There were only a few patrons, men and women in quiet, expensive clothes who never looked up. They were part of the scenery. Ellie felt completely out of place in her simple gray coat and jeans. Her fingers nervously traced the rim of the water glass the bartender had placed before her without a word. She had arrived 15 minutes early, her stomach a tight knot of acid and anxiety. She kept her eyes down, studying the condensation on her glass as if it held the secrets of the universe. She didn't want to see him arrive. She wanted to pretend this was all a terrible, vivid dream. But you cannot miss the arrival of Damien Costello. He did not so much enter the room as the room's atmosphere shifted to accommodate him. A subtle change in pressure, a deepening of the shadows. She felt his presence before she saw him. When she finally forced herself to look up, he was standing by her booth. He wore a dark gray suit that fit him so perfectly, it seemed to have been constructed around him. It made her own clothes feel cheap and ill-fitting. His dark eyes scanned her for a moment, and she felt a hot flush of embarrassment, of inadequacy. He wasn't just looking at her, he was taking inventory. He slid into the booth opposite her without a word, his movements fluid and economical. The silence stretched, and Ellie's rehearsed speech evaporated from her mind. All she could think about was the faint, silvery scar near his left temple, a tiny flaw in an otherwise intimidatingly perfect facade. He gestured to the bartender, who brought a small glass of amber liquid and placed it before him. Damien ignored it, his entire focus locked on her. A date, he said finally. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact he was examining from all angles. His voice was even lower in person, a calm rumble that vibrated through the leather of the booth. Ellie swallowed, her throat dry. Yes, for a family dinner. The words sounded childish, ridiculous in this place, in front of this man. He tilted his head slightly, a gesture that was both curious and predatory. Your family, he repeated, his gaze unwavering. The same family that would have preferred you let me choke on my steak at the Grand Tavern? Ellie flinched. She hadn't thought of it like that, but he was right. Her manager had been more concerned about a scene than about the guest's life. I didn't think about that, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. You should, he replied calmly. You should think about everything. He leaned forward just an inch, and the space between them seemed to shrink to nothing. You saved my life, Ellie. It was a debt I intended to repay. I assumed it would involve a sum of money, or perhaps a career opportunity. I did not expect it to involve dinner theater. A flicker of something, maybe amusement, crossed his features, so quick she almost missed it. It's not theater, she said, a spark of her old fire returning. The humiliation of her mother's phone call, the sight of Chloe's smug face in her mind's eye, it all came rushing back. It's an engagement dinner for my sister and my ex-fiancé. Damien's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. He saw it then, the whole ugly, pathetic story. He saw the betrayal, the shame, the quiet desperation that had led her to make such an insane phone call. He didn't offer pity. He offered something far more dangerous. He offered understanding. I see, he said, his voice soft. And what is my role in this little drama? I want you to be my date, she said, her courage building. I want you to sit there and smile and be so completely impressive that they can't look away. I want them to see that I haven't been sitting at home crying. I want them to feel small. And what do you want them to feel? He asked, his voice dropping even lower. Tell me exactly. The question hung in the air. This was the real negotiation. He wasn't asking about the plan. He was asking about her intent. The darkness she was willing to invite in. She met his gaze, the first time she had done so without wavering. I want them to be afraid, she confessed, the truth of it tasting like ash in her mouth. I want them to look at you and then look at me and feel a deep, cold sense of dread. I want them to realize they made a very, very big mistake. Damien leaned back, a slow, deliberate movement. He finally picked up his glass, swirling the liquid inside. The light caught the amber, making it glow like a captured flame. He was silent for a long time, and with every passing second, Ellie's hope withered. She had misread him. She had asked for too much. She had shown him the ugly, vengeful creature hiding inside her, and he was repulsed. She was about to apologize, to take it all back, when he spoke. Very well, he said. The debt is a life. The service you request is an evening of fear. The terms are acceptable. He took a small sip from his glass. But we will do this my way. This is not just about you attending a dinner. This is a performance, and every detail must be perfect. He placed a different card on the table, as black as the first, but with no name or number. It was just a heavy, expensive piece of cardstock. My tailor will be at your apartment tomorrow at 4. Do not be late. He stood to leave, the motion as silent and graceful as his arrival. He looked down at her, and for a moment the mask of cold control slipped. She saw a flicker of genuine curiosity, a hint of a man intrigued by a puzzle he hadn't expected. You have a fire in you, Ellie Vance, he murmured, almost to himself. You just let other people convince you it was only smoke. And then he was gone. Ellie sat alone in the booth, her heart hammering against her ribs. The black card on the table felt heavier than a block of lead. She had her wish, and she was terrified. The next day, her tiny apartment felt even smaller and more cluttered than usual. She had spent the morning cleaning frantically, scrubbing surfaces that were already clean, as if she could somehow wash away the ordinariness of her life before Damien's world intruded. At precisely 4 o'clock, the buzzer rang. An elderly man stood at her door, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, carrying a large leather-bound garment bag. He had kind eyes, but a mouth set in a firm professional line. He introduced himself only as Mr. Romano. He spoke with a thick Italian accent, his words few and precise. He didn't comment on her small living room or the stack of books by her worn-out armchair. He simply found a space, unzipped the bag with a quiet hiss, and revealed the dress. Ellie gasped. It was not a dress, it was a declaration, a column of deep blood-red silk that seemed to drink the light in the room. It was starkly elegant, with long sleeves, a high neckline, and a cut that was both modest and devastatingly sophisticated. It was the color of a fresh wound, the color of a dark rose, the color of revenge. Mr. Romano gestured for her to try it on. In her bedroom, Ellie stripped off her jeans and sweater, her comfortable, invisible clothes. The silk was cool and heavy against her skin. It slid over her body, fitting her as if it had been woven from her own measurements. There were no zippers, no buttons she could see. It simply became a part of her. When she looked in the small, slightly warped mirror on her closet door, she did not recognize the woman staring back. The dress changed her posture. It forced her to stand up straighter, to hold her head higher. The simple, severe lines drew attention not to the garment itself, but to her face, her neck, the line of her jaw. The color made her auburn hair seem richer, her green eyes brighter. This was not Ellie Vance, the quiet hotel worker, the forgotten daughter. This was someone else, someone powerful, someone dangerous. She walked back into the living room. Mr. Romano was standing with his back to her, looking out her small window at the brick wall of the building opposite. He turned as she entered, and for the first time his professional demeanor broke. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. He nodded slowly, a single approving gesture. "See," he murmured. "This is correct." He spent the next 20 minutes making nearly imperceptible adjustments with pins, his movements quick and sure. He never spoke, simply tugging the fabric here, smoothing it there. The entire experience was surreal, an invasion of her privacy that was somehow also an act of profound care. When he was finished, he helped her out of the dress, folded it with reverence back into its bag, and bowed slightly. "Mr. Costello will collect you tomorrow at 7:30, he said, and then he was gone, leaving the scent of expensive wool and the ghost of red silk in the air. Ellie felt like Cinderella, but she knew this fairy tale had a much darker ending. The following evening, the air in her apartment was electric with anticipation. She showered, letting the hot water run over her skin, trying to wash away the last of her fear. She did her makeup carefully, not the way Chloe did with bright colors and dazzling shimmer, but with subtle shadows that sharpened her cheekbones and a deep berry stain on her lips that echoed the color of her dress. When she slipped the red silk over her skin for the second time, it felt like putting on armor. It felt like coming home to a self she never knew she had. She was pacing the length of her small living room when the knock came. It wasn't the loud, impatient knock of a delivery person. It was a firm, solid sound. 3 distinct raps that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. She took a deep breath, her hand on the doorknob, and opened it. Damien stood there. He was dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to be cut from the night sky itself, with a crisp white shirt that only accentuated the stark power of his presence. His eyes swept over her, from the top of her head to the hem of her dress, and his expression was unreadable. But she saw a muscle in his jaw tighten, just for a second. "You're ready," he stated. She nodded, unable to speak. His presence filled her doorway, her hallway, her entire world. He seemed too large, too intense for her small apartment. He stepped inside, and the room seemed to shrink around him. He looked around, his gaze taking in her worn furniture, her collection of secondhand novels, the single framed photo on her wall of her and her father from years ago. It was a brief, comprehensive glance, and she felt utterly exposed, as if he had just read the entire story of her life. His eyes came back to her face. "One more thing," he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, velvet-covered box. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, were a pair of simple diamond earrings. They were not large or ostentatious like the gaudy jewels her mother favored. They were single, perfect, brilliant cut stones that glittered with a cold, clear fire. They were impossibly elegant. "I can't accept these," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They are not a gift," he corrected her, his tone leaving no room for argument. "They are part of the uniform. Put them on." Her fingers shook as she took the earrings from the box. The diamonds were cold against her skin. She fumbled with the back of one, her nerves getting the better of here. Damien stepped closer. The air crackled between them. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, a mix of bergamot and something dark and woody. He gently brushed her hair back from her ear. His fingers were warm as they took the earring from her hand. "Allow me, Homrani," he murmured. His touch was surprisingly steady as he guided the post through her earlobe and secured the back. Her breath hitched in her throat. He was so close she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. He did the other one, his movements just as precise, just as deliberate. When he was done, he stepped back, his gaze intense. The diamonds caught the low light, sending out tiny sparks of brilliance that framed her face. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and a strange, possessive satisfaction settled in his eyes. It was the look of an artist who had just placed the final perfect stroke on his masterpiece. Tonight, he said, his voice a low, binding promise. You are not a victim. The drive to the Gilded Lily was silent, but it was a silence filled with 1,000 unspoken words. Ellie sat in the passenger seat of his car, a machine so quiet and smooth it felt like they were gliding through the city. Her own beat-up sedan, parked back on her street, felt like a relic from another life. She stared out the window at the blurred lights of the city, the red silk of her dress a warm weight on her skin, the diamonds at her ears like two small, cold stars. She was no longer Ellie Vance. She was a creation, a weapon that Damien Costello had forged for a single night of battle. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with something else, a thrilling, terrifying sense of power. He pulled up not to the main entrance where valets scrambled, but to a discreet side entrance she had never noticed before. The engine died, plunging them into a sudden, intimate quiet. He turned to her. Are you ready? He asked. She thought of her mother's cutting words, of Chloe's triumphant smile, of Mark's casual betrayal. She thought of all the years she had made herself smaller, quieter, to keep the peace. She thought of the woman in the red dress she had seen in the mirror. Yes, she said, and her voice was clear and steady. They walked toward the restaurant's heavy glass doors. Through the beveled glass, she could see them. Her family, her mother, Eleanor, holding a glass of champagne, her posture rigid with satisfaction. Chloe, radiant and laughing, flashing her engagement ring as she spoke to Mark's parents. And Mark, smiling his easy, charming smile, his arm draped possessively around her sister's chair. They were a perfect picture of happiness, a happiness built on the ruins of her own. A wave of nausea and white-hot anger washed over her. Her steps faltered. She felt a hand on the small of her back. Damien's touch was firm, grounding. It wasn't gentle or comforting. It was a touch that conveyed ownership, a silent command. It said, I am here. This is happening. Do not break. She drew a ragged breath, leaning into the pressure of his hand for a fraction of a second. She could feel the warmth of his palm through the thin silk of her dress, a steady anchor in the storm of her emotions. He leaned down, his lips close to her ear, his voice a dark whisper meant only for her. Let them laugh. With a final deep breath, she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and let him guide her inside. The walk from the door to the table felt like a mile. Each step on the plush patterned carpet was a deliberate choice, a footfall into a life she was setting on fire. Through the warm golden light of the Gilded Lily, she could see them, her family. They were a perfect tableau of celebration, caught in a bubble of laughter and clinking glasses. Chloe was the sun at the center of their small universe, her blonde hair catching the light like a halo. Mark sat beside her, his arm draped possessively over the back of her chair, his smile the easy, charming one he had once given only to Ellie. Her mother, Eleanor, presided over it all, her posture ramrod straight, a queen surveying her perfect kingdom. The sight was a familiar ache, a photograph from which she had been neatly cut. Damien's hand was a steady, grounding weight on the small of her back. The fabric of the red dress was a thin barrier between his warmth and her skin. It felt less like a gentlemanly gesture and more like a claim, a silent declaration that she was with him. As they drew closer, a cousin, Sarah, was the first to look up. Her fork, laden with some delicate appetizer, paused halfway to her mouth. Her easy smile froze, then slowly melted away into slack-jawed confusion. Her eyes widened, flicking from Ellie to the dark, imposing figure beside her one. The ripple of silence began there. It spread across the table like spilled wine. Another relative's conversation faltered. Then Mark, sensing the shift in atmosphere, lifted his gaze. His smile did not just fade, it shattered. All color drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pale mask of shock. He looked as if he had seen a ghost, a ghost wearing a blood-red dress and escorted by the devil himself. His arms slipped from Chloe's chair. Chloe, annoyed by the interruption, followed his gaze. Her perfectly practiced smile faltered, twitching at the corners. Confusion warred with irritation in her bright blue eyes. She saw Ellie, and a flash of triumph crossed her face, the look of a victor pitying the vanquished. But then her eyes moved to Damien, and the triumph dissolved into pure, unfiltered disbelief. Finally, her mother's head turned. Eleanor's face, usually a carefully controlled mask of polite society, went rigid. Her lips thinned into a severe white line. There was no shock, only a cold, immediate fury that promised retribution. The happy chatter that had filled the air moments before was gone, replaced by a dense, suffocating silence. The only sounds were the distant murmur of other diners and the frantic, panicked thumping of Ellie's own heart. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on them as the maitre d', a man who exuded unflappable calm, led them the final few feet. He seemed entirely oblivious to the emotional carnage unfolding. "Mr. Costello," the maitre d' said, with a deferential nod, gesturing to the two empty seats. "Your table." The seats were positioned awkwardly at the end, a clear afterthought. It was a subtle, dismissive placement. Damien ignored the implied slight. Instead of taking the chair offered, he walked around the table, his movements fluid and deliberate. He pulled out a chair for Ellie, not at the end, but one that squeezed her between a distant uncle and an empty space directly across from Chloe and Mark. The arrangement was a disruption, forcing the neat little circle to break and reform around her. He slid her chair in, his hand brushing her shoulder, a silent message of support. Then he took the seat beside him, his presence instantly commanding the space. He was a block of granite in a garden of delicate flowers. Ellie kept her hands in her lap, her fingers twisting the fabric of her napkin. She could feel Mark's eyes on her, wide and panicked. She could feel Chloe's stare, sharp and analytical, trying to understand, to categorize, to regain control. And she could feel her mother's gaze, a physical weight of condemnation that she had borne her entire life. But for the first time, it didn't make her want to shrink. It made her want to sit up straighter. A waiter, sensing the tension, hurried over to pour them water. The simple act of filling their glasses felt monumental, a drumbeat marking the beginning of the battle. Damien leaned in toward Ellie, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "Are you all right?" She gave a small, jerky nod, not trusting her voice. Her throat was tight, her mouth dry as dust. He seemed to understand. He placed his hand on the table, palm up, a silent invitation. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, his thumb beginning to stroke the back of her hand in a slow, soothing rhythm. It was an anchor in the swirling vortex of her family's silent judgment. The contact was shockingly intimate, a gesture of casual possession that sent a jolt through her. It was an act, she reminded herself. It was all part of the performance. Eleanor was the first to recover her voice. She cleared her throat, the sound sharp and brittle in the silence. "Ellie, you're late." It was not a question. It was an accusation. "There was traffic," Ellie said, her voice barely a whisper. "You should have planned accordingly," her mother clipped back. "Punctuality is a sign of respect." Before Ellie could wither under the familiar criticism, Damien spoke. His voice was calm and even, yet it cut through the tension with absolute authority. "The fault is mine, Eleanor. I was delayed. I do hope you can forgive my disrespect." He used her first name with an unnerving familiarity. No one but her late husband had ever called her mother Eleanor with such casual confidence. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. She was clearly thrown off balance, unsure how to respond to a man who refused to be intimidated. "And you are?" she asked, her tone frosted with disdain. "Damien Costello," he replied simply, his gaze steady. He didn't offer a handshake, didn't try to ingratiate himself. He simply stated his name as if it were all the introduction needed. The appetizers began to arrive, a parade of colorful, meticulously arranged plates. Seared scallops, tiny bruschetta, delicate parcels of pastry. The food was meant to be a distraction, a way to ease back into polite conversation. But no one seemed to have an appetite. Mark pushed a scallop around his plate with his fork, his eyes darting nervously between Damien and Ellie. Chloe, however, was recovering her poise. She was a performer, and the stage had been taken from her. She needed it back. "Well, Damien," she began, her voice a little too bright, a little too sweet. "It's so wonderful that Ellie finally has someone to bring to these things. We were all starting to worry about her." The jab was aimed at Ellie, a reminder of her previous solitude, her perceived patheticness. Damien didn't even look at Chloe. His attention remained entirely on Ellie. He smiled at her, a small, private smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle slightly. "I'm the lucky one," he said, his voice soft. "It's not every day you meet someone with her integrity." The word hung in the air. Integrity. It was a direct contrast to everything happening at the table. It was a shield for Ellie and a sword against everyone else. He then turned his attention to the plate in front of her. "You haven't eaten," he murmured, picking up a piece of bruschetta topped with roasted red pepper and goat cheese. He held it out for her. "Try this." The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, that for a moment Ellie forgot where she was. She forgot the animosity, the revenge plot, the cold knot of dread in her stomach. In that moment, there was only him, his dark, focused eyes, and the food he was offering. She parted her lips automatically and took a bite. The flavors exploded on her tongue, sharp and creamy and sweet. She had been so tense she hadn't realized how hungry she was. He watched her chew, a look of satisfaction on his face. Then he leaned in closer, his lips near her ear. His breath was warm. He whispered something, a single absurd sentence about the chef's questionable choice of garnish. It was a simple, silly observation, utterly out of place in the charged atmosphere. And Ellie laughed. It wasn't a polite titter or a nervous giggle. It was a genuine, surprised burst of laughter that came from deep within her. The sound was so foreign, even to her own ears, that it startled her. It felt rusty, like a piece of machinery that hadn't been used in a very long time. The effect on the table was instantaneous. Her mother's face tightened further, a mask of cold disapproval. Mark flinched as if he'd been struck. But it was Chloe's reaction that was the most telling. Her fake smile vanished completely, replaced by a look of raw, venomous jealousy. It was the look she used to give Ellie when they were children, when Ellie had received a gift she coveted. That laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness, was something Chloe thought she owned, something she had taken along with everything else. To hear Ellie give it to this imposing stranger was an intolerable theft. Damien's thumb continued its lazy circles on the back of her hand. He had given her that moment of levity deliberately. It was a strategic move as calculated as any business deal. He was showing them that he could make her happy. He was showing them that they no longer had any power over her emotions. He controlled the atmosphere now. He was the one pulling the strings. Ellie caught her breath, the laughter dying in her throat. The reality of the situation came crashing back down. This man was a weapon, and he was wielding himself with terrifying precision. She looked at him, at the calm intensity in his eyes, and a shiver of fear, mingled with a strange and thrilling sense of power, ran down her spine. She wasn't just a spectator in her revenge. She was a willing participant, and her partner was more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. The main courses were served in a tense, near-silent procession. Steaks and elaborate fish dishes were placed on the table, their rich aromas filling the air, but they might as well have been serving ash. The small talk had dried up completely. The only sounds were the scrape of silver on porcelain and the occasional nervous cough. Mark hadn't eaten a single bite. He just stared at his plate, his knuckles white where he gripped his fork. Eleanor had been watching Damien, her eyes narrowed in appraisal. She had been trying to place him, to fit him into her rigid social hierarchy. The suit was expensive, impeccably tailored. The watch on his wrist was subtle but clearly worth more than the car Ellie drove. He was not, as she had probably first assumed, some lowly employee from the hotel. He carried himself with an aura of immense power, an unnerving stillness that made everyone else at the table seem loud and clumsy. This lack of information, this inability to categorize and control him, was infuriating to her. She waited for a lull, for the waiter to retreat after refilling Damien's water glass. She set her knife and fork down carefully, placing them parallel on her plate. It was the signal that she was about to hold court. "So, Damien," she began, her voice smooth as silk but with an edge of sharpened steel. She leaned forward slightly, a predator closing in. Ellie has been so very quiet about you. She paused, letting the implication of secrecy and shame hang in the air. Tell us, what is it that you do? The question was a weapon. The emphasis on the word do was a social test, a demand for him to present his credentials, his net worth, his place in her world. It was designed to diminish him, to expose him as unworthy of sitting at her table, of breathing her air. Ellie's breath hitched. This was it, the moment she had both dreaded and anticipated. How would he answer? Would he lie? Would he give some vague corporate title? Damien did not seem fazed. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his water, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. He set the crystal glass down on the white linen with a soft, definitive click. A faint smile touched his lips, but it was a cold, sharp thing that held no warmth. It was the smile of a wolf showing its teeth. I'm in the acquisitions business, he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. Ellie saw a flicker of relief in her mother's eyes. Acquisitions. It sounded respectable. Corporate. It meant mergers, buyouts, hostile takeovers. It was a world Eleanor understood, a world of money and power played out in boardrooms. But Damien was not finished. He let the first part of his answer settle, allowing them to construct their own comfortable narrative. Then he delivered the rest of the line with surgical precision. I help people resolve, he paused, letting the silence stretch until it was taut with tension. Complicated debts. As he said the final word, debts, his eyes moved from Eleanor. It was a flick of a glance, almost too fast to register, but Ellie saw it perfectly. His gaze landed on Mark, just for a second. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, a promise. It was a key turning in a lock deep inside a prison Mark hadn't even realized he was in. The effect was devastating. Mark, who had been pale before, turned a ghastly shade of white. A sheen of cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He made a small choke sound and his fork, which he had been gripping like a lifeline, slipped from his trembling fingers. It clattered onto his plate with a sound that was shockingly loud in the oppressive silence. Every head turned toward the noise. Mark didn't seem to notice. He was staring at Damien, his expression one of pure, abject terror. He looked like a man who had just been told the exact date and time of his own demise. Ellie felt a cold, sharp thrill pierce through her. It was a terrible, exhilarating feeling. She had brought a storm to their sunny little picnic, and its name was Damien Costello. She had only told him the bare minimum about Mark's financial dependence on her family's connections, about the whispers of a business partnership that had solidified his choice of Chloe over her. She had given him a thread, and he had just shown them all that he held the entire rope. Eleanor was, for one of the few times in Ellie's memory, completely speechless. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She stared at Damien, the condescending matriarch suddenly transformed into a confused, wary woman who had just realized she had invited a predator into her home. The social rulebooks she had lived by her entire life had no chapter for a man like this. It was Chloe who finally broke the spell. She could not stand the loss of control, the fear that was now the central focus of the table. Her engagement, her perfect night, was in ruins. She had to reclaim it. With a gesture that was both desperate and defiant, she lifted her left hand, angling it so the overhead lights caught the massive diamond on her finger. The ring flashed, sending out brilliant shards of white light. It was the ring Ellie had once shown her on a website late one night, whispering about her future with Mark. Well, Chloe said, her voice high and strained, a desperate attempt at nonchalance. She admired the glittering stone on her own finger. While some people are busy with debts, some of us are celebrating something much more permanent. She looked directly at Ellie, her eyes blazing with a challenge. Isn't it just perfect, Mark? She demanded, trying to pull him back into their shared narrative of happiness. Mark didn't answer. He couldn't seem to tear his horrified gaze away from Damien. Damien, for his part, barely acknowledged Chloe's theatrical display. He did not give her the satisfaction of a full reaction. His eyes flickered down to the diamond ring for a fraction of a second, his expression one of utter dismissive boredom. It was the look one might give a cheap piece of costume jewelry. Then his gaze returned to Ellie. The coldness vanished, replaced by an astonishing, focused warmth that made her skin tingle. He leaned in close again, his shoulder brushing hers, his voice a low, intimate murmur that was nevertheless pitched just loud enough for the entire silent table to hear. "We'll get you something much better." Damien's words hung in the air, heavier than the scent of wine and roasted duck. The quiet promise of a better ring was a declaration of war disguised as a lover's whisper. Across the table, Chloe's manicured hand, the one wearing Mark's ring, tightened around her fork. Her knuckles went white. My mother, Eleanor, set her crystal water glass down with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Her smile was a thin, brittle line. Mark looked from the glittering diamond on Chloe's finger to me, his expression a pathetic mix of confusion and alarm. He was a man caught in a current, realizing far too late that it was pulling him out to sea. For a moment, I felt a dizzying surge of power. It was intoxicating, this feeling of being seen, of being chosen, even if it was all part of an elaborate performance. Damien's thumb stroked the back of my hand, a steady, grounding rhythm against my own frantic pulse. His gaze remained on me, a silent question in his dark eyes. "Are you okay?" The gesture was so simple, so unexpectedly tender, it almost made me forget the viper's nest I was sitting in. I gave him the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. The first act was over. Now the real drama was about to begin. Chloe pushed her chair back abruptly, the legs scraping against the polished wood floor. "I just need a little air," she announced to no one in particular, her voice strained. She didn't look at Mark. She didn't look at our mother. Her gaze, sharp and full of venom, was fixed on me. It was a summons. Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked stiffly toward the back of the restaurant, her designer dress shimmering under the low lights. My mother's eyes darted to me, cold and commanding. "Alara, go with your sister." It wasn't a request. It was an order to go and clean up a mess she believed I had created. I felt Damien's hand give mine a slight squeeze before letting go. A silent permission, a reminder that I was not walking into this alone. I slowly placed my napkin on the table, my movements deliberate. I could feel every eye on me as I stood and followed the path my sister had blazed. The plush velvet and warm lighting of the dining room gave way to the cold, echoing corridor that led to the restrooms. The air here was different, chilled by the air conditioning and smelling faintly of floral cleaning products. It was a sterile, impersonal space, a fitting backdrop for the conversation we were about to have. The restroom was all white marble and gleaming chrome, the bright, unforgiving lights a stark contrast to the restaurant's intimate gloom. Chloe was standing in front of the long mirror, but she wasn't fixing her makeup. She was just staring at her own reflection, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The dazzling smile she wore for the world was gone, replaced by a sneer that twisted her beautiful features into something ugly. She heard me enter, and her eyes flicked to my reflection in the mirror, meeting mine. "Who is he?" she hissed, her voice low and furious. The sound bounced off the cold tiles. "What did you do, Ellie? Find the one man in the city more terrifying than Dad's ghost to ruin my night?" I walked slowly toward the sinks, my heels clicking a steady rhythm on the floor. I placed my small clutch on the marble countertop, my hands surprisingly steady. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Chloe." She spun around, her face flushed with anger. "Don't play dumb with me. You've been planning this, haven't you? You couldn't just be happy for me. You've never been able to stand me being happy." The accusation was so familiar, a weapon she had wielded against me since we were children. Anytime I had something, anything at all, she had claimed I was flaunting it just to make her feel small. Now she was using the same tired argument to justify her own monumental betrayal. A cold calm settled over me. The years of swallowing my anger, of biting my tongue to keep the peace, they were over. The girl who would have flinched and apologized was gone. In her place was a woman wearing a blood-red dress, with a man made of shadows waiting for her at the table. "Happy?" I let out a short, hollow laugh. The sound was foreign, even to me. "You call this happiness? This performance? You're wearing a ring that Mark picked out from a list I made. You're planning a wedding I dreamed of. You are living a life you stole." My voice was quiet, but each word was a carefully sharpened icicle. You didn't just take my fiancé, Chloe. You took my future. You took it and you paraded it in front of me, expecting me to applaud. She recoiled as if I had struck her. Her blue eyes, usually so bright and confident, were wide with shock. This was not the sister she knew. This was not the quiet, accommodating Ellie who always stood up to side. I didn't steal anything, she stammered, her own voice losing its sharp edge. Mark and I, we fell in love. It just happened. He wasn't happy with you. You were always so morose, so serious. He needed someone who could make him laugh. Someone who could advance his career. I finished for her, my voice flat. Someone whose family connections were more useful. Don't insult my intelligence by calling it tough. You saw an opportunity and you took it. You've been taking things from me my whole life, Chloe. My toys, my friends, mom's attention. I just never thought you would take the man I was going to marry. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of frustration, not remorse. So this is your revenge? Bringing that man here to scare us? To make Mark jealous? It's pathetic, Ellie. He'll be gone tomorrow and you'll still be alone, working in that hotel. I leaned forward slightly, my gaze locked on hers. I could see my reflection in her tear-filled eyes. I looked strong. I looked dangerous. You built your happiness on my tears, little sister. Tonight, I just decided to stop crying. I picked up my clutch from the counter. As for Damien, I said, letting his name fall into the sterile air between us, you should be more worried about why he's here than when he's leaving. I turned and walked out, leaving her standing alone in the bright, cold room. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a wild drumbeat of fear and exhilaration. I had never spoken to her like that. I had never stood up for myself against my family in such a direct, unforgiving way. Part of me was terrified, waiting for the ceiling to collapse. But another larger part of me felt a sense of profound, liberating relief. The chains were breaking. As I walked back down the corridor, a figure stepped out from a small alcove near the bar, blocking my path. It was Mark. His face was pale and slick with a thin sheen of sweat. He looked frantic. Ellie, thank God, he said, his voice a desperate whisper. He reached for my arm, but I stepped back, and his hand fell, hovering uselessly in the air between us. Don't touch me, Mark, I said, the coldness from my confrontation with Chloe still clinging to my voice. Please, just listen to me for 1 second, he pleaded, his eyes darting around as if he expected my mother to appear. This whole thing with Chloe, it's not what you think. It's complicated. Complicated? I repeated the word, tasting its absurdity. It seems quite simple to me. You were my fiancé. Now you are hers. The only complicated thing is how you manage to sleep at night. Your mother, he started, then stopped, shaking his head. My father, there are business pressures, things you don't understand. I was going to tell you, I was trying to find the right time to explain. His excuses were a pathetic whirlwind of blame and self-pity. He was trying to paint himself as a victim of circumstance, a pawn in some larger game. He was weak. I had loved this man, I realized with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity. I had planned a life with this weak, cowardly man. The thought was more humiliating than the betrayal itself. Explain what, Mark? I asked, my voice dangerously soft. That your love was conditional? That your promises had an expiration date tied to a stock portfolio? There is nothing you can say that I want to hear. I tried to step around him, but he moved again, blocking me. His desperation was escalating. Ellie, who is that guy? What are you doing with him? He's dangerous. You need to get away from him. Let me help you. It was then that a shadow fell over him. Mark didn't seem to notice at first, too lost in his own panic. But I saw it. I felt the temperature in the corridor drop by several degrees. Damien was simply there, standing directly behind Mark, as silent and sudden as a change in the weather. He hadn't made a sound. One moment Mark was pleading with me. The next, this immense, formidable presence was at his back. Damien placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. It was a deceptively gentle gesture, but Mark flinched as if he'd been burned. He froze completely, his eyes widening in terror as he slowly turned his head to see who was there. Damien's face was a mask of cold indifference. His eyes, however, were burning with a chilling intensity. He leaned in, his lips close to Mark's ear, and his voice was a low, guttural whisper, too quiet for anyone else to hear. But I saw the effect of his words on Mark's face. I couldn't hear what he said, but I could imagine. It wasn't a loud threat. Damien's power wasn't in volume. It was in precision. He was a surgeon of fear. I watched as every last drop of color drained from Mark's face. His mouth fell open slightly, a silent gasp. His body started to tremble, a fine, uncontrollable shaking. He looked like a man who had just been shown a glimpse of his own grave. Damien removed his hand from Mark's shoulder. He gave him a gentle, almost paternal pat on the cheek, a gesture of absolute dominance. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," Damien said, his voice back to its normal, calm volume. Mark stumbled backward, his legs clumsy and uncoordinated. He looked at me one last time, his eyes filled with a new kind of terror. It wasn't just fear of Damien, it was fear of me. He finally understood that I was not the woman he had discarded. I was the woman who had brought this man to his table. Without another word, he turned and practically fled back towards the dining room, nearly colliding with a waiter carrying a tray of drinks. Damien turned his attention to me. His expression softened, the cold fury in his eyes replaced by a quiet concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. I could only nod, my throat suddenly tight. I had just witnessed a display of raw, silent power that was more frightening than any shouted threat. I had brought this man here as a prop, a piece of theater. But he was real. The danger he represented was very, very real. And a dark, shameful part of me reveled in the terror I had seen in Mark's eyes. "Let's go back," Damien said softly. He offered me his arm. This time when I took it, it felt different. It was no longer just for show. It was a lifeline. We returned to a table thick with tension. Chloe had returned from the restroom, her eyes red and puffy, though she was trying to hide it behind a watery smile. Mark was staring down at his plate, pushing a piece of food around with his fork, his hand still shaking. My mother and Mark's parents were engaged in a strained, stilted conversation about the weather, their words brittle and meaningless. The arrival of the main course did little to break the spell. The waiters moved around us with practiced grace, placing plates of perfectly cooked steak and glistening fish onto the table. The smell was rich and savory, but I had no appetite. No one did. The food sat largely untouched. The celebration was dead. My mother, ever the hostess, tried to resuscitate it. She raised her champagne glass. "Well," she said, her voice artificially bright, "I think this calls for a toast. To Chloe and Mark, to their beautiful future together." Mark's father, a portly man with a perpetually worried expression, quickly raised his own glass. "To the happy couple," he boomed, a little too loudly. Chloe managed a weak smile and raised her glass. Mark followed suit, his movements slow and robotic. I felt Damien shift beside me. I looked at him and saw that he was already watching me. He gave me a look. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. "It's time." My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This was it, the point of no return. Damien stood up. He was tall, and his presence immediately commanded the attention of the entire table, silencing my mother mid-sentence. He picked up his own untouched champagne flute. The crystal glittered in the low light. "A toast is indeed in order," he said, his voice smooth and resonant, carrying easily across the table. My family stared at him, their expressions a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They were waiting for him to deliver some polite, empty sentiment. They were waiting for the performance to end. He raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said, his eyes sweeping over Chloe and Mark, who both flinched. Then his gaze settled on my mother and Mark's father. "And to old secrets." With his other hand, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He didn't pull out a wallet or a phone. He produced a thin, plain manila file. It was no more than 20 pages thick, held together by a single metal clip. It looked harmless, insignificant. He held it for a moment, letting the anticipation build. Then, with a quiet, deliberate movement, he let it go. The file fluttered down and landed in the exact center of the table with a soft, definitive thud. It landed directly between the untouched plates of steak and the wilting floral centerpiece. I believe this concerns both the Vance and Thorne family finances, Damien stated calmly, his voice devoid of any emotion. A little light reading for after dinner. Silence. A profound, absolute silence fell over the table. The background chatter of the restaurant, the clinking of distant silverware, it all faded away into a dull roar in my ears. All I could see was that file. From my angle, I could clearly read the neatly typed label on the cover. It was simple. It said, Project Nightingale. And beneath that, Vance Thorne Consolidated Holdings. Cayman Accounts Overview. My mother's breath hitched in a sharp, strangled gasp. Her hand flew to her throat, her perfectly applied lipstick suddenly looking garish against her pale skin. Across from her, Mark's father stared at the file as if it were a venomous snake poised to strike. Chloe, who understood nothing of finance, understood the look of pure horror on her father-in-law-to-be's face. Her lower lip began to tremble, and a single fat tear escaped and traced a path through her foundation. But the worst was Mark. He wasn't looking at the file. He was looking at his father. His expression one of dawning, abject terror. The last pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in his mind. He finally understood. This was not about a jealous ex-girlfriend. This was not about a new romance. This was about ruin, complete and total. And I had just served it to them on a silver platter. The file landed on the white tablecloth with a sound that was barely a whisper. Yet it echoed in the sudden absolute silence like a crack of thunder. No one moved. No one breathed. The cheerful chatter of the gilded lily faded into a distant, muffled hum, as if the world outside their table had ceased to exist. Ellie watched a drop of red wine tremble on the rim of her mother's glass. It was the only thing in the universe that seemed to be moving. Eleanor's gasp was sharp, a tiny, splintered sound. Chloe's carefully constructed smile dissolved, her face crumbling as the first tear traced a path through her perfect makeup. Across the table, Mark Thorne stared at the folder, his skin turning a sickly, pale gray. His eyes, wide with terror, flickered from the damning cover page to his future father-in-law, a man who now looked like a complete stranger. The air was thick with the metallic taste of fear. Then, Damien moved. His movements were fluid and unhurried, a stark contrast to the frozen tableau of horror around them. He placed his napkin beside his plate. His hand found the small of Ellie's back, a warm, firm pressure that was both a shield and a command. He was her anchor in the storm he had unleashed. "I believe our evening is concluded," he said, his voice calm and low. It cut through the suffocating tension, addressed to no one and yet to everyone. He pulled Ellie's chair back for her. The scrape of its legs against the polished floor was obscenely loud. Ellie stood, her own legs feeling like hollow reeds. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her as they walked away from the table. She did not look back. She could not bear to see the full scope of the devastation. But she could feel it. She could feel her mother's stare burning into her spine, a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated hatred. She could hear Chloe's broken sobs beginning in earnest, no longer pretty, but the ugly, gasping cries of someone whose world had just been torn apart. This was what she wanted, wasn't it? This was the justice she had craved in the long, lonely nights. This was her revenge. So why did it feel like she was the one bleeding out on the floor? Damien's hand never left her. He guided her through the maze of tables, a silent, imposing figure parting the sea of curious onlookers. The heavy oak door of the restaurant closed behind them, and the sounds of her family's ruin were finally cut off. The cool night air hit her face, smelling of rain in the city. She took a breath, but it felt like inhaling shards of glass. The drive was silent. Damien's car moved through the glittering city streets with a quiet hum, a bubble of absolute stillness. Ellie leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the passenger window, watching the lights blur into long, wet streaks of color. The adrenaline that had carried her through the evening was gone, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness. Inside the car, the silence was louder than all the shouting had been in the restaurant. It pressed in on her, heavy and suffocating. She thought of Chloe's face, not the triumphant, smug face that had haunted her for months, but the lost, terrified expression of a little girl. She thought of her mother's rigid posture, The pride that was Eleanor Vance's entire identity shattered in a single moment. She had done this. She had brought this man, this force of nature, into their lives and pointed him at their hearts. A single tear escaped, hot and sudden against her cold skin. Then another, a tremor started in her chest, a deep, shuddering quake she couldn't control. A sound clawed its way out of her throat, a choked, wounded sob. And then the dam broke. She wept. It was not the quiet, dignified crying of a heroine. It was an ugly, desperate collapse. Great, gasping sobs tore from her lungs, shaking her entire body. Tears streamed down her face, blurring the city lights into a meaningless swirl. It was the grief for a sister she once loved, for a mother she had always longed for. It was the shame of Mark's betrayal, the humiliation of being cast aside. It was the crushing guilt of what she had just done, and the terrifying, exhilarating relief that it was finally over. All of it poured out of her in a raw, unfiltered torrent of pain. Through it all, Damien said nothing. He did not offer a placating "it's okay." He did not reach out to touch her. He simply drove, his eyes on the road, his presence a steady, unwavering constant in her storm. His silence was not cold or uncaring. It was something else entirely. It was a space vast and empty that he was allowing her to fill with her grief. He was letting her fall completely apart without judgment, and in that moment, it was the greatest act of kindness she had ever known. She cried until she was empty, until her throat was raw and her breaths were just ragged, hitching gasps. By the time she looked up, her face wet and her body aching, she realized they were not near her small, shabby apartment building. They were pulling into a private, underground garage beneath a tower of black glass and steel that pierced the night squeaking. "Where are we, child?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. "My home," Damien replied simply, killing the engine. The silence that fell was different now. It was softer, less charged. He led her from the car to a private elevator that ascended with a smooth, silent rush. Ellie felt detached, as if she were watching a film of someone else's life. Her beautiful red dress was wrinkled, her makeup was ruined, and she felt stripped bare, raw and exposed. The elevator doors opened not into a hallway, but directly into a sprawling living space. Ellie stopped, her breath catching. The apartment was immense, a study in minimalist perfection. Polished, dark floors reflected the light like a still lake. The furniture was sparse, elegant, and severe, but all of it was dwarfed by the view. One entire wall was made of floor-to-ceiling glass, revealing a panoramic, godlike vista of the city. The endless grid of lights spread out below them, a galaxy of human ambition and lonely souls laid at their feet. It was the most beautiful and intimidating place she had ever seen. It was a fortress of power and solitude. "Sit," Damien said, his voice gentle. It was the first time she had ever heard that tone from him. She sank into a large sofa made of soft black leather. It felt like sinking into a shadow. He didn't turn on any bright lights, leaving the room illuminated only by the soft glow of the city outside. He walked to a bar built seamlessly into one wall, the shelves lined with crystal decanters. She heard the clink of a heavy stopper and the glug of liquid being poured. He came back and handed her a heavy crystal tumbler. Inside, a few fingers of amber liquid glowed. "Brandy," he said. "Drink it." It was a command, but it felt like a prescription. Her hands were still trembling as she took the glass. The weight of it was solid, real. She took a sip. The spirit was smooth but powerful, a liquid fire that burned a path down her throat and settled as a warm, spreading bloom in her chest. It was a clean, sharp shock that cut through the last dregs of her hysteria. He took a seat in a low armchair across from her, his own glass in hand. He didn't drink. He just watched her, his dark eyes unreadable in the dim light. The silence stretched, but it was no longer empty. It was patient. He was waiting. And the words began to come. At first, they were just fragments, broken pieces of a life spent in the shadows. "She always wanted a blonde daughter," Ellie whispered, staring into her glass. "My mother. She used to tell me my hair was an unfortunate inheritance from my father's side." Chloe came out with golden hair and blue eyes. She was perfect. She took another sip of the brandy. The warmth spread. "Mark and I met in college. He wasn't like he is now. He was funny, he was kind, or I thought he was. We talked about everything: a house with a big garden, two kids, a dachshund, all the stupid, normal things. A dry, humorless laugh escaped her. Stupid. I was so stupid. Damien remained silent, his stillness an invitation to continue. He was a confessor in a dark, quiet church, and she was purging a lifetime of sin and sorrow. When my father died, everything changed. My mother, she became harder. All that mattered was appearances, the right family, the right connections. Mark's family had that, and I was part of the plan, until Chloe decided she wanted him. Her voice cracked on her sister's name. It wasn't a grand seduction. It was 1,000 tiny cuts, a shared secret joke here, a lingering touch there. I saw it. I saw it happening, and when I tried to talk about it, they looked at me like I was crazy, hysterical, jealous. She looked up from her glass and met Damien's gaze. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of what she saw there. She was just seen. The engagement ring, she said, her voice barely audible. About a year ago, I was looking at magazines. I saw a ring, a cushion-cut diamond. I told Chloe it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I even bookmarked the page. She must have told him. She must have showed him the exact one. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it hung in the air between them. It was not a crime of passion. It was a premeditated theft of a life, of a dream. They didn't just take my fiancé, she choked out, a fresh wave of grief washing over her. They tried to take my sanity. They made me feel like I was the one who was wrong, that my pain was an inconvenience to their happiness. My own mother, she told me to be gracious, to be happy for my sister, to stand at her wedding and smile. She finally let it all out. The years of being the second best daughter, the quiet dismissals, the way her accomplishments were minimized while Chloe's were celebrated. The profound loneliness of having a family that saw her as an obstacle. She spoke until the words ran out, until all the poison was drained, leaving only a profound, bone-deep weariness. The penthouse was quiet again. The only sound was the faint, distant hum of the city far below. Ellie's eyelids were impossibly heavy. The brandy glass was empty in her lap. The red dress, the armor she had worn to battle, now felt like a heavy, suffocating shroud. "I'm so tired," she murmured, her words slurring slightly. The deep leather of the sofa was pulling her down. "Then sleep, Alara." Damien's voice came from the darkness. She didn't have the strength to protest, to say she should go home. Home didn't feel like home anymore. Maybe it never had. She curled into a ball on the vast sofa, pulling a decorative throw blanket over her shoulders. The city lights outside the window blurred, the millions of individual points of light melting into a soft, hazy glow. Her last conscious thought was that for the first time in years, she felt utterly and completely safe. Her eyes drifted shut. Damien sat in the armchair for a long time watching her. He watched the tense lines of her face finally relax in sleep. He saw the faint, dried tear tracks on her cheeks. He had gone into this arrangement for his own reasons, to satisfy a debt, and perhaps to witness a little chaos. He had expected a transaction. He had not expected this raw, desperate courage. He had not expected to find a kindred spirit in the quiet hotel worker, a soul who had been pushed into a corner and had chosen to fight back with the only weapon she could find. Slowly he stood up and walked over to the sofa. He looked down at her, a fragile shape lost in the shadows of his stark, empty home. He reached under the collar of his tailored shirt and pulled a thin silver chain over his head. On it was a small, worn medallion. The features of the saint carrying a child across a river were smoothed down by time and touch. It was the one thing he owned that was not part of the empire he had built. It was a relic from a different life, a different man. He didn't put it around her neck. That would be an act of possession, a claim he had not yet earned. Instead, he knelt beside the sofa. Very gently, he took her hand. Her fingers were limp in sleep. He carefully uncurled them and placed the cool, smooth disc of silver into her palm. Then he folded her fingers back over it, creating a small, protected fist. He tucked her hand, now holding his past, close to her chest. He stood and watched her for another moment, her breathing now deep and even. The fierce woman who had burned down her own life was gone, replaced by someone vulnerable and exhausted. But in her hand, she held a silent promise. She was not alone in the ashes. The first thing she felt was weight, a small, solid weight in her palm, its edges smoothed by time and touch. The second was light, a cold gray morning light filtering through a wall of glass, painting the city below in stark shades of concrete and steel. Ellie opened her eyes slowly. She was on a dark leather sofa, a soft wool blanket tucked around her shoulders. Her body ached, a deep, weary ache born from a sleep so profound it felt like a temporary death. She uncurled her fingers. Resting in her hand was a small, silver medallion on a simple chain. A man carrying a child on his shoulders. Saint Christopher. Damien's. The memory of the previous night crashed down on her, not as a chaotic wave, but as a series of sharp, distinct images. The stunned face of her mother, Chloe's manufactured tears, Mark's pale, slack-jawed terror, the file hitting the white tablecloth. She sat up, the blanket pooling in her lap. The penthouse was silent, a fortress of quiet suspended 1,000 feet above the noise of the world. Her own apartment, with its thin walls and noisy neighbors, felt like a lifetime ago. Her phone lay on the polished concrete floor beside her discarded shoes. She picked it up. The screen lit up with a barrage of notifications. 23 missed calls from her mother, 15 from Chloe. A string of text messages, each more frantic and furious than the last. "Where are you? What have you done? You have ruined this family, Alara. Answer me right now." For a moment, her thumb hovered over her mother's name, the old, ingrained instinct to obey, to explain, to apologize, stirring within her. Then she pressed the button on the side of the phone and watched the screen go dark. She slid the medallion's chain over her head, tucking the cool silver disc beneath the collar of her dress. It felt like a secret. It felt like armor. A soft sound made her turn. Damien was standing by the vast window, holding 2 white ceramic mugs. He was dressed in dark trousers and a simple gray sweater that softened the sharp lines of his frame. He looked less like a crime lord and more like a man at home in his own solitude. He walked over and placed one of the mugs on the low table in front of her. The rich, dark scent of fresh coffee filled the air. "Good morning," and he said. His voice was calm, a low rumble in the quiet room. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a steady, unnerving watchfulness. "I trust you slept well." Ellie nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She wrapped her cold hands around the warm mug. My family," she began, her voice a rough whisper. "The engagement is off," Damien stated, as if discussing the weather. He took a slow sip from his own mug. "Mark Thorne and his father left the restaurant shortly after we did. Your mother and sister remained for some time, attempting to salvage the evening with the other guests. It was not successful." He paused, his gaze fixed on the sprawling city. "Your mother, Eleanor, has been attempting to contact my office since 7 this morning. She believes this is a misunderstanding that can be rectified with a conversation. She is mistaken." The finality in his tone sent a shiver through Ellie. This was not a game. This was the precise, calculated demolition of a life she had once thought was unshakable. "And Mark?" she asked, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. "The Thorne family's primary investors are pulling out," Damien said. "The news of their financial irregularities travels quickly in certain circles. They are in free fall. They are trying to contain a fire with a glass of water." Ellie stared into her coffee. The black liquid reflected a distorted, wavering version of her own face. She had wanted revenge. She had wanted them to feel a fraction of the pain they had inflicted on her. But seeing the stark reality of it laid out so clinically was something else entirely. It was terrifying. It was liberating. She felt a tear slide down her cheek, hot and unexpected. Not a tear of sadness, but of some complex, overwhelming release. Damien said nothing. He simply waited, giving her the space to feel it. After a long moment, she wiped the tear away with the back of her hand and met his eyes. "What happens now?" He set his mug down and walked over to a sleek, dark wood desk. He retrieved a simple manila folder and a small, leather-bound checkbook. He placed them on the table next to her coffee. "What happens now is up to you, Ellie," he said, his voice softening slightly. My debt to you is paid, but I feel our arrangement is not yet complete. I created this chaos for you. I will not leave you in the middle of it." He opened the folder. Inside was a passport with her picture, but a different name. Sarah Peterson. There were bank statements, a driver's license, a social security card, a complete identity. "This is a clean slate," he explained. "A new life. There is an apartment waiting for you in Lisbon. It overlooks the sea. The account linked to this identity has enough funds for you to live comfortably for the rest of your life. You could get on a plane this afternoon and never see any of them again. No one would ever find you." Ellie stared at the documents. Sarah Peterson. The name was a stranger's. The idea was intoxicating, to simply disappear, to leave behind the ghost of the girl who was always second best, the girl who was tossed aside, to go somewhere warm and build a life from scratch, a life that belonged only to her. No more of her mother's cutting remarks, no more of Chloe's saccharine poison, no more memories of Mark's betrayal. It was everything a cornered animal could want, an escape route, a way out of the trap. She looked up at Damien. His expression was neutral, giving nothing away. He was offering her an exit, no strings attached. It was a generous offer, an honorable one in its own dark way. But as she looked at the name Sarah Peterson, a strange rebellion stirred in her heart. Running away felt like another kind of defeat. It felt like admitting that Alara Vance was so broken she had to be discarded. It felt like letting them win in the end. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "You said your debt was paid." "I don't like loose ends," he replied simply. "And I don't like seeing a debt of honor repaid with a ksham. Your family, this city, it is a cage for you now. I am offering you the key." He gestured to the folder. "Take it, Ellie. Be free." She thought about it, truly thought about it. She pictured the apartment by the sea, the sun on her face, the anonymity. For a moment, it was a beautiful dream. But then she looked at Damien, at the man who saw her not as a victim, but as someone with the audacity to ask for his help. He hadn't pitied her. He had respected her rage. He had honed it into a weapon. Running away felt like a betrayal of that, a betrayal of the new, hard strength she felt coiling in her gut. She was about to speak, to tell him her decision, when a sharp, insistent buzz echoed through the penthouse. Damien's posture didn't change, but a stillness came over him. He walked to a discreet panel on the wall and pressed a button. "Yes?" A calm, professional voice came through the speaker. "Sir, apologies for the disturbance. We have a situation in the lobby. A Mr. Markham Thorne is demanding to see Miss Vance. He is, causing a scene." A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced through Ellie's newfound resolve. "Mark. Here. Why?" The professional voice continued. "He claims it's a matter of life and death. He is refusing to leave. Security is with him now." Damien's gaze flicked to Ellie, his dark eyes searching hers. He pressed another button, and a video feed appeared on the panel. It was Mark, but it wasn't the polished, confident man she had planned to marry. His hair was a mess, his expensive suit was rumpled, and his tie was pulled loose. His face was blotchy and red, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate energy. He was yelling at one of Damien's security guards, a large, impassive man in a dark suit. The sound was muted, but his desperation was plain to see. He looked broken. He looked pathetic. "Tell him to leave," Ellie said, her voice coming out as a harsh rasp. "I don't want to see him." Damien watched the screen for a moment longer. "He seems to believe you are his only hope," he murmured, a note of dark irony in his voice. He looked back at her. "Are you sure? Sometimes seeing the consequences of your actions firsthand provides a certain closure." The thought was revolting. To face the man who had shattered her world, now that his own was shattering around him. He had run to Chloe when her family's money offered him a better future. Now that the future was a black hole of debt and scandal, he was running back to her. He wasn't seeking her forgiveness. He was seeking a lifeboat. He saw her connection to Damien as a new source of power, one he could use to save himself. The realization landed with the force of a physical blow. A wave of pure, cold anger washed over her, extinguishing the last flicker of pity. She stood up, her legs feeling surprisingly steady. Let me see him, she said, her voice low and even. Damien raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in his otherwise stoic expression. He studied her face, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He spoke into the intercom. Allow him up, but have Thomas and Samuel escort him. He does not enter the residence. He waits in the elevator lobby. Yes, sir, the voice replied. The video feed clicked off. A heavy silence descended on the room. Ellie could hear the blood pounding in her ears. This was it. The past banging on her door, begging to be let in. She walked past Damien out of the main living area and into the stark, private hallway that led to the penthouse's elevator entrance. The space was all polished stone and shadow, cold and unforgiving. She could feel Damien's presence behind her, not crowding her, but watching. A silent guardian at her back. A soft chime announced the elevator's arrival. The brushed steel doors slid open. Mark stood there, flanked by two men who were easily twice his size. The moment his wild eyes landed on Ellie, his face crumpled. The anger and fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a raw, desperate plea. He looked like a lost child. Ellie, he breathed, his voice cracking. He took a step forward, but Damien's men, Thomas and Samuel, moved in perfect, subtle unison, blocking his path without ever touching him. It was a wall of muscle and tailored suits. Mark stopped, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He was trapped between the men, just a few feet away from her, but it might as well have been a mile. Ellie said nothing. She simply stood there, her hands at her sides, her expression a carefully constructed mask of cold indifference. She let him look at her. She let him see that the weeping, heartbroken girl he had left behind was gone. In her place was a woman he didn't recognize, standing in the entryway of a world he could never enter. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. All the things she had once dreamed of screaming at him, all the accusations and questions, they all seemed pointless now. The damage was done. The verdict was in. He stared at her, his chest heaving, his handsome face a mess of tears and desperation. He had lost everything. His fiancé, his future, his family's reputation. And now he was looking at her as if she held the key to getting it all back. His eyes begged her for a sign, for a flicker of the old Ellie, the one who would have rushed to comfort him, to fix things. But he found nothing. He saw only a stranger. Mark's last shred of composure broke, his face twisted in anguish. Ellie, please, he begged, his voice a raw, broken sob that echoed in the cold stone lobby. Help me. The air in the penthouse lobby was cold, smelling of polished steel and antiseptic lemon. It was a sterile, silent space designed to intimidate, and Mark Thorne looked utterly out of place within it. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit rumpled as if he had slept in it. His face, once so quick to offer a charming smile, was now pale and tight with a desperation that was ugly to watch. Two of Damien's men stood like statues, blocking his path, their presence a silent, unbreachable wall. Mark's eyes, wild and pleading, were locked on Ellie. Ellie, please, he begged, his voice cracking, echoing slightly in the cavernous space. Help me. For a single fleeting second, the old Ellie flickered within her, the one who would have rushed forward, the one whose heart would have broken to see him in such pain. But that girl was gone. She had been burned away in the fire of a single dinner, leaving behind something harder, something forged. Ellie looked at the man who had shared her secrets, her dreams, the man she had planned a life with, and she felt nothing but a profound, chilling emptiness. The love had been hollowed out, and what remained was just scar tissue. She took a slow step forward, the sound of her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. She stopped a few feet from him, just beyond his reach. She looked directly into his eyes, letting him see the absolute absence of pity in her own. I already helped you once, Mark, she said, her voice quiet, yet it cut through his frantic energy like glass. I helped you see what you truly wanted, the money, the status, my sister. You made your choice. She paused, letting the words settle on him, each one a small, heavy stone. Now live with it. A sob caught in his throat. He looked as though she had physically struck him. No, Ellie, it wasn't like that. I love you. It was always you. The words were a pathetic lie, a last-ditch effort from a drowning man. She gave a small, humorless shake of her head. Without another word, she turned her back on him. It was the easiest and the hardest thing she had ever done. She did not look back as she heard him call her name again, his voice choked with despair. She did not look back as the heavy glass doors slid shut, cutting off the sound for good. She just kept walking toward the elevator, her spine straight, leaving her past behind in a cold, sterile lobby. Back in the penthouse, the silence felt different. It was no longer the heavy, grief-stricken quiet of the night before. It was a space cleared, waiting. Damien stood by the vast wall of windows, a silhouette against the sprawling city. He had not followed her down, had not interfered. He had trusted her to handle it. He turned as she entered, his dark eyes searching her face, not for tears, but for resolve. "He's gone," she said, her voice stone. "I know," Damien replied. He gestured to a leather briefcase on the polished concrete coffee table. "Everything is prepared. A new name. A quiet life in a place where no one has ever heard of the Vances or the Thorns. Enough money that you will never have to work for a man like me again." It was a clean break, an escape. It was everything she thought she wanted just 24 hours ago. To run, to hide, to forget. She walked over to the table and looked at the briefcase. It represented safety, anonymity, a peaceful existence far from all this pain. But as she looked at it, she felt a strange sense of revulsion. It was a golden cage, offered in place of her old one, a comfortable prison of someone else's making. She ran her fingers over the cool, worn silver of the St. Christopher medallion he had given her, which she now wore on a simple chain around her neck. It felt like a piece of his history, a piece of his hidden self, and it gave her courage. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "No," she said. A flicker of surprise, faint but definite, crossed his features. "The location is not to your liking? We can arrange somewhere else." "It's not the location," she said, taking a breath. "It's the arrangement. Damien, I'm not running away. Not anymore." She took a step closer to him, closing the distance between them. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. "Last night, you didn't just expose my family. You showed me who I was, a victim, someone who let people walk all over her and then cried when her feet got dirty." Her heart was pounding, a fierce, wild rhythm in her chest. This was a bigger gamble than bringing him to dinner. This was a gamble for her entire future. "I'm not your charity case," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I won't be a project you fix and then send on her way, a debt repaid. I'm not that girl anymore. She died in that restaurant." She stood before him now, her head held high, her green eyes unwavering. "So I'm not taking the money, and I'm not leaving." Damien was perfectly still, his expression unreadable. His stillness was more unnerving than any outburst. "Then what is it you want, Alara?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I want to stay," she declared, "but I won't be your kept woman or your grateful rescue. If I stay as your partner." The word hung in the air between them. Partner. It was a word he understood in terms of business, of power, of alliances forged in steel and sealed with trust earned over years. He studied her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch, stripping away every pretense. He saw not the frightened waitress he had met, but a woman who had walked through fire and was no longer afraid of the heat. He saw a defiance that mirrored his own. A slow, dangerous smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was not a smile of humor, but of recognition. "Partnership has costs," he said, his voice soft. "It demands loyalty. It demands strength. My world is not a kind one." "I'm not asking for kindness," Ellie replied, her voice just as soft, just as certain. "I'm asking for a seat at the table. Your table." He reached out, not to touch her face, but to gently take the medallion hanging between them. He rubbed the smooth silver between his thumb and forefinger, his eyes never leaving hers. "The last person who was my partner," he said quietly, "gave me this. It was a long time ago." He let it go, the cool metal falling back against her skin. "All right, Alara, partner." Months passed. The scandal of the Vance and Thorne families had been a brief, vicious storm in the city's financial circles. The fraudulent accounts were exposed, fortunes were wiped out, and reputations were shattered beyond repair. Eleanor Vance had sold her home and disappeared from the social scene, her worst fears of public ruin realized. Chloe, stripped of her fiancé and her family's wealth, had reportedly moved to a small town, a fallen princess in a kingdom of her own making. The Gilded Lily had become a ghost story. Tonight, Ellie stood in the grand ballroom of the city's art museum. The room was a sea of black ties and glittering gowns, the air thick with the scent of champagne and ambition. It was a charity gala, one of those events her mother would have given anything to attend. Ellie wore a gown of deep emerald silk that clung to her form, her auburn hair swept up, revealing the elegant diamond earrings Damien had given her. They were the only jewelry she wore, besides a silver medallion tucked discreetly beneath her dress. She was no longer the girl who blended in. As she moved through the crowd, she felt the weight of people's gazes. They were looks of curiosity, of fear, of respect. She was Damien Costello's partner. The whispers followed them everywhere. But for the first time in her life, she didn't care what people whispered. She met their eyes with a cool, steady confidence that offered nothing and conceded nothing. Damien was at her side, his presence a familiar grounding force. He introduced her to powerful people, not as his date, but simply with her name. "This is Alara Vance." The statement was enough. Her association with him gave her a power she had never imagined, but the confidence she projected was entirely her own. At one point, they stood near a balcony overlooking the museum's gardens. The noise of the party faded to a low hum. Damien turned to her, his expression serious. "Are you happy, Ilara?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it held a world of meaning. She thought of her old life, the constant low-grade anxiety, the desperate need for her mother's approval, the hollow ache of a love that was never truly hers. She compared it to this life. A life on a knife's edge, filled with danger and uncertainty, but a life that was hers, a life where she was seen, respected, and valued for her strength. She looked at him, at the man who had shown her the darkness in the world, and then given her the power to command it. "I'm not the girl who was looking for happiness anymore," she said honestly. "I was looking for justice. I was looking for myself." She paused, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "But yes, Damien, I am." His own eyes softened. He lifted his hand, his fingers brushing a stray curl from her temple. It was a gesture of profound tenderness in the midst of this public place. Just then, a man they had spoken to earlier approached them again. As Damien turned to speak with him, Ellie's gaze drifted across the room. She watched the dance of power, the false smiles, the whispered negotiations. It was a different kind of battlefield, but she knew how to navigate it now. She felt Damien's hands seek hers behind her back, his fingers laced with hers, a firm, possessive, and deeply reassuring grip. It was a silent message, for her and her alone. We are together in this. She squeezed his hand in return, her gaze meeting his over the shoulder of the man he was talking to. In that single look, a universe of unspoken understanding passed between them. It was a look of loyalty, of shared secrets, of a bond forged in revenge and solidified in partnership. They were two sides of the same coin. The shadow and the woman who was no longer afraid of the dark. The next morning, Ellie found the small velvet box in the back of her closet. She opened it. The engagement ring glittered up at her, a perfect cushion-cut diamond. It had once been the symbol of all her hopes and dreams. Then it had become the symbol of her deepest pain, a glittering monument to betrayal. Now, as she looked at it, it was just a rock, a beautiful, expensive, and utterly meaningless object. It held no power over her anymore. She placed it in a simple, padded mailer. She took out a small, plain card and wrote 4 words on it, a reminder of the cost of things. She didn't sign her name. They would know who it was from. She sealed the envelope and dropped it in a public mailbox on a busy street corner. The clunk of the package dropping inside was a sound of finality. It was the last ghost of her old life, exorcised. She walked back to the penthouse, feeling lighter than she had in years. The city looked bright, the sky a crisp, clear blue. When she entered the apartment, Damien was waiting for her, standing by the windows, just as he had been that first morning. He didn't ask where she had been or what she had done. He didn't need to. He saw the peace on her face. He held out his hand. She walked to him and placed her hand in his. He pulled her gently toward him until she was standing in the circle of his arms. The whole city spread out before them, a kingdom at their feet. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. His eyes, so often dark and calculating, were filled with a raw emotion that stole her breath. It was not possession, it was not gratitude. It was something far deeper, something that felt like home. Alara, he murmured, his voice thick with a feeling he rarely showed. She didn't need to answer. She rose on her toes and met his lips with her own. The kiss was not a negotiation. It was not part of a bargain, not a performance for a crowded restaurant. It was quiet, and it was certain. It was a seal on a future they had chosen, a promise made not with words, but with the silent, perfect understanding of two souls who had found their other half in the most unlikely of shadows. It was the end of her revenge and the true beginning of her life. What would you have done? One line in the comments. Let's argue it out together. Where did the story catch you? Which scene made you stop and think? A small like it is a small move, but it's a big support for this channel. See you in the next story. Subscribe so you don't miss it.